Hello and welcome back to the Bookshelf Odyssey. My name is Art, and today we are beginning our read along of Fahrenheit 451, specifically the 60th anniversary edition of this book, because it's full of not just the book, but essays and commentary about Fahrenheit 451, including the introduction, which is by Neil Gaiman. And that's what we're going to cover in today's video, along with introducing you to this wonderful book and very relevant book for today. So Fahrenheit 451 was first published on October 19th, 1953. So this year we're actually celebrating 70 years of Fahrenheit 451. And I feel like there needs to be another updated edition, maybe in another 5 years or so. But I think there would be great to have a book about the some essays, more essays about the relevance of this book, because as I'm reviewing it, I'm just reminded of how much our world and our country today needs the message of this book. So if you are wanting to read along with me, fear not, we haven't actually started the book yet. We'll begin next week. And I'll be reading pages, in this edition, it's pages 1 through page 21 for next week. And that covers the beginning portion where I believe it's up to where he meets Clarice. And then following that scene is where we'll end for the video for next week. I'll talk about it then. So if you read that section, you want to comment here, do that. Go to the Discord channel or the Voxer channel. I'll have those links below. Voxer might actually work best for this. I find that just being able to talk, it saves me time than typing out something. I tend to not want to do that more. So I don't know what that says about me as a person, but anyway, somehow get me your thoughts as we read this, and I'd love to integrate them into upcoming videos. So what is this book about? It says this: that this is a classic of world literature that is set in a bleak dystopian future. Today, its message has grown more relevant than ever before. Guy Montag is a fireman. His job is to destroy the most illegal of commodities, the printed book, along with the houses in which they are hidden. Montag never questions the destruction and ruin his actions produce, returning each day to his bland life and wife, Mildred, who spends all day with her television family. But when he meets an eccentric young neighbor, Clarice, who introduces him to a past where people didn't live in fear and to a present where one sees the world through the ideas in books instead of the mindless chatter of television, Montag begins to question everything he has ever known. And I love that description because it doesn't give away much about what's in the book. Some of the themes this book discusses are censorship and suppression of ideas, technology's impact on human connection, the power of knowledge, apathy and conformity, predicting technological advances. Bradbury, there's a couple of concepts and thoughts in this book that I think Bradbury captures just brilliantly. And it will really make you think about the power of stories and the power of books and how we consume that, or do we consume that? Now, our discussion might get a little political, and I apologize for that. And I do want to, again, remind you that as we discuss these things, to be kind and thoughtful to each other, even if we have disagreements on political viewpoints, on different things that are happening in our culture today. I will just give you a little bit about my own personal background. And I am a registered independent voter. I come from a background of from the Republicans, but the events since about 2016, I switched mine to just be independent. I thought that more accurately reflected who I am and my viewpoint, because there are some things that Republicans do that I would support, and then there were some things that Democrats were doing that I supported. And anyway, so I felt that being an independent voter was a better representation of who I was. So that's the background I'm coming from. and I'm going to try to be fair to different points of view, but I would always appreciate discussion, as long as it can be thoughtful and stay on the topic and not become personal attacks. As I always try to say, in spite of my views and in spite of, and I might disagree with you, I want you to know that all points of view, so that whether you're Democrat or Republican, your thoughts and discussion are welcome here, but we need to keep things civil. I mean, we just got to. We can't engage in hate. All that to say, again, there are trends and things happening in our world, in our country today. Just know I am still personally thinking through these things, and I understand some of the concern about why there has been censorship recently, in things like Roald Dahl, some of his publications being changed. That seems to be more, for the left side, it seems to be doing that, but then the right, we have censorship of things like what books can be in a school library and which can't. Essentially, I am against censorship. I believe we should have the freedom of speech. And that means that there will be books and viewpoints published that I don't agree with, but I can't expect, certain points of view to be suppressed so that only mine can be promoted. I don't think that's fair. Now, yes, there are points of view that are very dangerous, that can cause harm to people. And so what do we do with that information? For instance, I like to read Victorian literature, and so you'll often come across points of view and content that is racist, which is, in my mind, very harmful to people. And it's a very ugly point of view. I want to be very careful as we consider those things too, because while I thoroughly disagree with that kind of a viewpoint and worldview that, that thought that slavery was okay, or that, just all the thoughts that come with racism, I'm obviously against that. But I think it's also important to not just whitewash history and remove all those things, so that we can have an accurate understanding of what happened in the past. And hopefully that will serve us as a warning for what's, so that we don't repeat those same mistakes. This is a very complicated subject, and we'll probably deal with that as we go along. But I just wanted to give you kind of an introduction to that, some of my background and thoughts about censorship. I always encourage people, if there's content in a book that you don't like, just do what I call self-censor. That, okay, you know what, this author has viewpoints and it really bothers me. I can't deal with it. I can't read it. I'm not going to have it in my own personal library. But we need to be aware of those things and how we can address those things as we go forward. But this idea of enforced censorship, that, I think that's beginning to get on a kind of a treacherous slope. But we'll talk about that more as we cover those things in Fahrenheit 451. I want to go ahead and look at the introduction that Neil Gaiman writes for this book. I was kind of working on a script to how I'd introduce this book, but then I read his introduction, and he pretty much talks about the things I was going to talk about and then some, and he does it in such a beautiful way that I just thought, let's just look at the introduction himself. Now, if you haven't read the introduction, that's okay. I think there's a few minor hints that might be considered spoilers, so I'll be careful of that. I won't be giving spoilers in the discussions, other than I'll be spoiling or talking about the pages we read. So all you'll get from me today is just what's in the introduction. And here's how Neil Gaiman begins his introduction. He says, "Sometimes writers write about a world that does not yet exist. We do it for 100 reasons. Because it's good to look forward, not back. Because we need to illuminate a path we hope or we fear humanity will take. Because the world of the future seems more enticing or more interesting than the world of today. Because we need to warn you, to encourage, to examine, and to imagine." And he goes on to mention how this is a book, that Fahrenheit 451 is a book of warning It is a reminder that what we have is valuable, and that sometimes we take what we value for granted. So I love that he talks about as a writer, there are hundreds of reasons why people write. And again, he says that this is a book of warning. But even in that, I can see how Fahrenheit 451 is really all of these things. It is a book that looks forward. It is a book that can help us illuminate our path. It is a book that warns and encourages and examines and imagines, the world we live in. And what if things continued on that path, what would happen in the future? He also says that there are 3 phrases that make possible the world of writing about the world of not yet. He says you can call it science fiction or speculative fiction, but there are 3 simple phrases. He says, what if only, and if this goes on. And he says, if only lets us explore the glories and dangers of tomorrow. If only dogs could talk. If only I were invisible. The question, if this goes on, is the most predictive of the 3. He says it takes an element of life today and asks what would happen if that thing became bigger, became all pervasive, and changed the way we thought and behaved. I could see Fahrenheit 451 doing this, taking that idea of what if book burning continued? What if book banning continued? What would be the end results of that? What would happen if people stopped reading? And that's really I think that the heart of what Fahrenheit 451 is about, at least one of the main thrusts. Neil Gaiman says that Fahrenheit 451 is that 3rd question. If this goes on, what will happen if this goes on? I kind of see some overlap between the 3 questions, really. And this is an interesting thought from Neil Gaiman. He says, Ray Bradbury was writing about his present, which is our past. He was warning us about things. Some of those things are obvious, and some of them, half a century later, are harder to see. And I think that's interesting that we are reading a book, again, that idea of things continued as they are, or if this particular thing continued on, here's what the future would be. It's almost like, if you like time travel stories, it's almost like a branch in the timeline, that we're going to follow. Gaiman goes on to say this is really a fantastic thought, which, by the way, Neil Gaiman is, if you haven't read his works, just a beautiful, articulate, creative storyteller. I haven't read all of his works. I've mostly read some of his young adult works and short stories, but highly recommend you check him out if you haven't. If you like Neil Gaiman, you'll like Ray Bradbury, and I think if you like Ray Bradbury, you'll like Neil Gaiman. I see Bradbury's handprints all over many of Gaiman's writings. He says that if someone tells you what a story is about, they are probably right. If they tell you that that is all the story is about, they are very definitely wrong. Any story is about a host of things. It is about the author. It is about the world the author sees and deals with and lives in. It is about the words chosen and the way those words are deployed. It is about the story itself and what happens in the story. It is about the people in the story. It is polemic. It is opinion. An author's opinion of what a story is about are always valid and are always true. The author was there, after all, when the book was written. She came up with each word and knows why she used that word instead of another. But an author is a creature of her time, and even she cannot see everything that her book is about. I like what he says there, and I like that he uses the feminine pronoun for author, and I wonder why he did that. But it's almost, I guess my opinion of that is that he is imagining an author as like a mother creating, birthing something, that they are producing this story like a mother produces a child. And okay, yeah, I know that it takes a man and a woman to create a child. I understand how that works, okay? But I like I don't know, that was just something that stuck out to me, and I kind of liked it. All right, so he gets into the context of writing Fahrenheit 451. The book was published in, like I said, in 1953. In 1953, the comparatively recent medium of radio was already severely on the wane. Its reign had lasted about 30 years, but now the exciting new medium of television had come into ascendancy. And he talks about how as more and more people began watching television, because of the the quality of the screens, that a lot of people were watching it with the lights off so they could see it better, and how Bradbury perhaps began to think that if everyone is sitting around in the dark watching a television, there are going to be less people reading and more people watching the TV. And I think Bradbury saw the powerful influence screens could have on the mind long before, we all carry around our cell phones now and are basically walking around looking at our hands the whole time. Now, I'm not trying to be too critical about cell phone use because I am using mine quite constantly. In fact, I'm recording on my cell phone right now. But like anything, they can be a good tool or they can be used inappropriately. He goes on to talk about how the news channels in America warned of juvenile delinquents. The Cold War was going on. Everyone lived in fear of nuclear war in the Third World War. It was a time of culturally, a time of great change. You're coming out of World War II. You're living in fear of World War III. And perhaps more and more people, there was the whole book banning, the McCarthyism and the extreme measures people went to trying to rout out communists. Books were being banned, all these things. And so this is the context that Bradbury is writing. And he says, it's thinking basically, if these things continue, here is a possible outcome. And then Gaiman will talk about how Bradbury wrote Fahrenheit 451 at a library in the UCLA's Powell Library. Bradbury would go to the basement where the typewriters are. You could put a coin into the typewriter and type for a certain amount of time. And so Bradbury himself also writes and talks about this in some of his interviews, that, he would put the quarters in, he would type as fast and as furious as he could and try to get as much done as he could in the short amount of time he had, because, he was a poor, struggling author. He had 2 kids at home, so that's why he was going to the library to kind of escape the noise so he could concentrate and write this book. And when he would need inspiration, the library is a perfect place for this book to be written. He would go upstairs, gather inspiration from the books that were there, and then he'd go back down and keep writing. Now, concerning the title, Fahrenheit 451, it's said that is the degree of heat in which paper burns. And what he did was that he called the Los Angeles Fire Department and asked them what temperature paper burned. And I remember, I think it was in Sam Weller's biography, that he reported this story and said, that the fire chief or the fireman, whoever answered, didn't know. And so he just came up with a number that sounded right. And, as Gaiman says in his intro, it says that Fahrenheit 451, somebody told him. He had his title. It didn't matter if it was true or not. So that this book was published and acclaimed. People loved the book and they argued about it. It was a novel about censorship, they said, about mind control, about humanity, about government control of our lives, and about books. And so it's about all these things. And as Gaiman would say, but that's not all that it's about. It's, I guess, at its simplistic nutshell, Fahrenheit 451 is a book about book banning or book burning. But that's not all that this book is about. So I hope to explore some of those themes as we read on in the book itself. Gaiman talks about his history with Fahrenheit 451, and I like how the book has changed for him over the years. He said he read Fahrenheit 451 as a boy. He said, I did not understand Guy Montag, did not understand why he did what he did, but I understood the love of books that drove him. Books were the most important things in my life. The huge wall screen televisions were as futuristic and implausible as the idea that people on the television would talk to me, that I could take part if I had a script. We'll uncover that storyline, but yeah, that's technology that can happen today. And then he says, when I reread it as a teenager, it had become a book about independence, about thinking for yourself. So you see how as he's changing, the book is changing as well. And then rereading it as an adult, he says, I find myself marveling at the book once more. And goes on to talk about some of the plot details and things that kind of reflect the society today. And then he comes back to the young reader finding the book today. He says, a young reader finding this book today or the day after tomorrow is going to have to imagine first a past, then a future that belongs to that past. And I think that's part of the genius of Bradbury's book, is that you have to do that. It helps exercise your mind. It is still relevant to our today as well as our tomorrow. Unfortunately, I would love nothing more than to say, boy, this book has not become relevant anymore because, people suppressing information, and we're not rewriting history, and, we're not banning books, but we are. So this message is needed. We need to listen and read what he has to tell us. He says that we need to transmit our stories and our thoughts from one generation to the next. If we lose them, we lose our shared history. We lose much of what makes us human. And fiction gives us empathy. It puts us inside the minds of other people, gives us the gift of seeing the world through their eyes. Fiction is a lie that tells us true things over and over. I love that quote. Fiction is a lie that tells us true things over and over. But look at all the things that literature and storytelling does for us. It's a way that tells us about truth. It helps us develop empathy. It puts us inside the minds of other people to understand their points of view. Even if you don't agree with it, you can at least understand where they're coming from. And I think that can go a long way to help promote civil discourse. And if we lose them, we lose our shared history. So now the world that we're going to find in Fahrenheit 451 has, I guess in a sense, lost all that. They've lost their shared history. They've lost what makes them human. They've lost the ability to empathize because they're not reading. They can't see the truth of what's happening around them. And they are dulling their senses with drugs and frivolous television, for lack of a better description. And then Gaiman talks a little bit about his relationship with Ray Bradbury, that he knew him for the last 30 years of Bradbury's life. And he says, I was so lucky. He was funny and gentle, and always, even at the end when he was so old he was blind and wheelchair bound, even then, enthusiastic. He cared completely and utterly about things. He cared about toys and childhood and films. He cared about books. He cared about stories. Then he says, this is a book about caring for things. It's a love letter to books, but I think just as much it's a love letter to people and a love letter to the world of Waukegan, Illinois in the 1920s, the world in which Ray Bradbury had grown up, in which he immortalized as Greentown in his book of childhood, Dandelion Wine. Then he says a couple things more that kind of are some minor spoilers about the end, but I won't get into those yet. So that's Gaiman's introduction to the story. Beautifully written. And Mr. Gaiman, if you are watching this, and I know you are, then would you please write a collection of essays about Ray Bradbury's work? I would love to read more about what you have to say about Bradbury. I think that would definitely be a book I would put on my shelf. So just to kind of wrap this up, a little bit about my history with Bradbury and this book. I know I've talked about it before on my channel, but I discovered Bradbury. I was about 13, 14 years old, found him in the library. The Martian Chronicles was the first book of his that I read. I was looking for something a little bit more mature because my reading tastes were changing, and I loved stories and I loved the library. And I discovered that. I thought the book sounded familiar. I read it and it just blew me away. And I've been a Bradbury fan ever since. I've read pretty much everything he's written. I have a massive collection of Bradbury books that I think I might have done a video about even, so I'll share that link if I did. He just had and continues to have a profound impact on my thought process, even on my worldview, I would say, and the importance of reading and the importance of stories. I first read Fahrenheit 451. I believe I was a teenager at the time, and I think I would share with Gaiman's perspective that I understood that the love of books that this book promotes. But as I've read it over the years, and I must have read it 4 or 5 or 6 times now, it has changed, and what I get out of it has changed. I revisited it again as a young adult. I was in my 20s. My wife and I had, it was shortly after we had first been married. She was doing some student teaching, and one of the classes she was teaching was on the book of, was on Fahrenheit 451. So we read that together at home and then she would teach it in class, in her class the following day. And I really loved that experience and enjoyed that experience. And I'm hoping to rekindle some of that with you all as we read together this masterpiece of a book. And it's been a couple years since I've read it again. I can't remember when I read it last. It's been a few years. So I'm excited to get back into it and see how this book has changed. And I know since I've read it last that I have changed. And so I am excited to see what this book has for me again. Now, I've said a lot about Fahrenheit 451. Let's not forget the very obvious is that this is a cracking good book. It is a great story. It is a compelling narrative. If you don't want to, wade into it from a scholarly perspective, if you just want to sit down and read a thrilling tale, then you can't go wrong with this book. It's at times dramatic. There's some tense moments, some scary moments, some exciting moments, some mysterious moments, and yeah, even a few heartbreaking moments. It has everything that you'd want in a good story. And that's why I consider this one of the foundational classics of American literature, is that it succeeds on all of these levels and yet continues to have a relevant message for our world today. So this week, your homework is to go and find a copy of Fahrenheit 451. Doesn't have to be this one. We're going to begin reading the first 20 or so pages of this story, and I'll see you next Friday with an update video on my thoughts on what we read this week. So let me know down below if you are going to join in with the reading, or if you've read it enough, you're familiar with the story. I would still love to hear your thoughts and questions you might have concerning the book. We'll keep the conversation going in the comments below. Before I go, I want to leave you with this quote from Ray Bradbury. As you think about this, you might think, well, books have never been easier to access. We can have them on our phones, on our Kindles, a computer, on the internet. They're digital. They're everywhere. Yes, but Bradbury said this: you don't have to burn books to destroy a culture. Just get people to stop reading them. And that's where the danger comes, and how easy it is. Yes, we have them digitally, but then how easy it is to change what's in there and to remove content or add content to a digital book, or even suppress it. It's still possible. So, today we might not see literal book burning going on like they did in, Nazi Germany, but I think that's a quote worth thinking about. You don't have to burn books to destroy a culture. Just get people to stop reading them. So, with that in mind, my encouragement to you is never stop reading. However you consume these stories, tell the stories that matter. And with that, I hope that you have a fantastic week and that you always just keep reading. Take care.